Kia ora koutou, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion on discovering democracy. It's under the auspices of the Federation of Workers' Educational Associations, and that's all the workers' educational associations around New Zealand, and we're being hosted here by the Wellington WEA, coordinated by Pat Bolster. Thank you, Pat. And of course, we're being physically hosted here at Massey University Media Studies Unit, and they're providing the facilities and the technical support. So thank you, Massey. I'm John Sullivan. I'm the president of the Canterbury WEA, and in my day job, I'm a community lawyer with Community Law Canterbury. The WEA philosophy includes promoting social justice and upholding a just and equitable society. And the forthcoming local and national elections, with them in view, we're video recording this panel discussion with the objective to provide a discussion starter for groups around the country to discuss democracy. Our panellists today, they include an historian, an activist, a trade union organiser and a city councillor. But of course they all have many other skills wrapped up in those occupations. And forgive me, panellists, for introducing you so peremptorily, but the audience will meet you individually shortly. I've asked the panellists to frame their comments so as to connect the issues they raise with people's lives and concerns as far as it's practicable. Each panellist, the format of this discussion, each panellist will have 5 to 6 minutes, and then after that we'll have a follow-up discussion, and the panellists can make further comments, make further points, raise, answer questions raised by other panellists. And then we'll ask the audience for questions later. Democracy. The concept always raises more questions than answers, and the panellists, we're asking you today to suggest some ways forward. Is democracy based on the fundamental premise of a fair and equal society where the views of one group don't overwhelm other groups? Democracy is necessarily representative, but is it enough for the public to vote, or do they have to act as well? Strict majoritarianism is clearly unsatisfactory. Narrow majorities engender dissatisfaction. We've dispatched first past the post in New Zealand for parliamentary purposes, but how satisfactory is the MMP replacement? How do we achieve participatory democracy? How do we achieve an informed democracy? Real consultation is obviously important, but how do we find ways to include the excluded in a well-functioning democracy? How do we fit in our Treaty of Waitangi partnership that's unique to New Zealand? How do we fit in the rights of the tangata whenua? How do we fit in the needs and aspirations of new migrants and the disabled community, just to name a couple of minorities? Our first panellist is Dolores Janiewski, and Dolores is an historian at Victoria University. She obviously has an historical perspective to democracy and can talk about the origins, but she'll also be au fait with current political movements and events, and I think you all know some of those that I'm referring to, and I wonder how they might be relevant to the lives of people in New Zealand preparing to exercise their rights to participate in the local and national elections. Dolores.
Hello, everyone. So, if the topic is discovering democracy, I come from a country which is still in search of it and has not always found it and sometimes lets it disappear quite quickly. And I'm referring to the United States of America, though I have been in New Zealand since 1989. Nevertheless, the U.S. tends to set some international agendas in various ways. So what happens there does have influence around the world. And I think the U.S. is not necessarily believing in that equal rights and equal justice that John has just mentioned. That hasn't ever necessarily been into American documents. There's liberty and, equality, the right and pursuit of happiness, and yet it was written by a slave owner. So there's been the U.S. as originally constituted was in fact a slave owner's republic, made by the wealthiest people in the colonies of that period, and that is still part of the genetic makeup of the United States. It still has Republican elements. And at times, many of the policies are against democracy and have been in different parts of the historical period. According to Wikipedia, in fact, all current governments tend to combine elements of democracy, but oligarchy and also monarchy in different ways. And thinking about the United States, I think we're in a very strongly oligarchy era. Where billionaires are very important political players, and that in fact is partly the result of one element of the U.S. government called the Supreme Court, which is in some sense either a monarchy or oligarchy, which ruled in 2010 that any restriction on the right of corporations to purchase political advertising was a violation of free speech, so they gave corporations the rights of free speech. More recently, they've given corporations the right of religion. So those entities that live forever are given more rights in many ways than the actual people. And that, I think, is a perversity. And I don't think even the Founding Fathers would have recognized that particular move. And so it makes a lot of difference in terms of who's on the court, who becomes president in the next time. There is now currently an 4-4, and some of the important issues facing the United States will be determined by who the fifth person is. Will it be issues about gun control, about this giving corporations the right of free speech, about the lack of any regulation of money in politics, any number. And also many restrictions currently in different states trying to restrict people from voting, which would seem to be moving in the opposite direction from democracy. So I think that the U.S. could serve as an instructive example of some of the issues you need to avoid. One of them is the role of money in politics, and New Zealand still has too much of that. There's still a pretty lack of regulation on how much political parties can acquire for their own kind of public relations. There's restrictions on the election spending, but not other elements of political parties. And that, of course, in the U.S. is gone to a very great extent because not only parties, but individual candidates need to amass large sums of money in order to even gain a nomination. And that is a real, how many old billionaires are there? I think there are currently about 400 or so in the United States. And they exercise far too much power, and many of them have their own particular candidate, and sometimes candidates claim to be billionaires, though perhaps that isn't necessarily the truth about Donald Trump. He has been known to not tell the truth always, and that may be another one of his untruthful statements. But nevertheless, the fact that he claims to be a billionaire and thinks that's a useful justification for standing for office, I think, is a sign of some serious problems in American politics. So we should think about democracy, and Americans tend to like to preach to the rest of the world and about democracy, and yet they have a very flawed system about which they speak. But I think there was an American scholar who was speaking, telling Iraqis how to organize a democracy, which seems a little bit farcical, but nevertheless, some of the things he said probably are useful, particularly if you found that they were being honored in the United States. So he talked about democracy as a political system for choosing and replacing the government. He talked about the active participation of the people as citizens in politics and civic life, the protection of the human rights of all citizens, a rule of law in which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens. I think those are probably valid principles. And of course, if you listen to the news, you'll find out how many times all of those are being violated in the United States. We still don't have a rule of law applying equally to all citizens. And that is an ongoing problem, which of course, those of us who've experienced it are well aware. Protection of human rights for all citizens, still obviously, even the right to vote isn't protected necessarily. Active participation, as you may know, the percentage of people voting in the United States, especially in the midterm elections when a president isn't on the ballot, average about 40%. It may get up to 50 or 60 in a presidential election, but still a large share of people don't vote, and those people tend to be the poorer members of American society. So the system is skewed in different ways to those who are more wealthier, and that shapes the politics of the United States. Free and fair elections, well, even Donald Trump thinks the elections aren't free and fair, so we will have to see if that is demonstrated. So I think those are, the United States can offer some instructive negative examples, and one of those issues is how do you keep citizens as equals when money becomes a very important component in the political system.
Thank you, Dolores.
Thank you.
All of the panellists will have the opportunity to speak again after our four panellists have given their formal presentation. So our next presenter is Asha Wilson-Goldman. And Asha is a communications person with the Public Service Association. He's also co-convener of the youth sector of the Council of Trade Unions. No doubt he'll have quite a focus on work, and as Pat commented to me earlier, we've got a long way to go to get some democracy at work, and I think it's probably a bit of a given. So promoting democracy in schools and at work and other institutions. Asha.
Kia ora, John, thank you, and kia ora koutou. Democracy, what is it? You know, this is a broad question, and I think a good place to start is that democracy isn't just a theory, it's not just an idea as nice or as wonderful as it might be. Democracy is a practice, and like any practice, you get better at it the more you do it. So let's have a look at how we do democracy. As we grow up from birth, we start to begin to walk and talk, we learn the authority of our parents. But where do we learn about democracy? Well, it's not at kindergarten. We're probably not quite at a stage to really comprehend having any real say in our lives at kindergarten, although there is to some extent something that could be said there. But at school, do we start learning about democracy? Well, at primary school, we're still very much under the sway of the authority of the teacher. We're given rigid lesson plans. We're given a structure that is put upon us, and it's not something that we really contribute to. At high school, it's actually much the same. There are some experiments around the country across New Zealand, and there are some experiments in other parts of the world in a more participatory education system where students can participate in the construction of what it is they want to learn and how they want to learn it. But that still isn't the norm. So we go through school learning about respecting authority. We go through school learning that the teacher knows best. And we go through school without any real conception that we can be in control of our own lives. After school, maybe we go to uni, maybe we go to a polytech, or maybe we go straight to work, where that idea is further reinforced, that our boss is in control of what we do day to day. They tell us what to do, it's our job to do it, it's not our job to question. Even if we can see things that we know they could be simplified, we know they could be made more effective, we know they could be made more efficient, that's not our place, that's management, that's the boss. And so we cede this ground to our superiors, supposedly, and we don't practice democracy. We're not given the space to do that. There are a few exceptions. Those exceptions, almost entirely, are places where we organise collectively with our workmates in a union. And there are those exceptions not just in the workplace, but also in some schools. We have a past in New Zealand, it's not often talked about, but we have a past of high school student unions. Of high school students getting together and saying, this isn't good enough, we want something better. And that's something that I wish we could explore more. That's something that I think, it saw a rise, the first student unions, in that era where politics seemed like an era where anything was possible. It seemed like a time where things could actually change for the better in the 60s and 70s. Some things did change, but often a lot of what happened just went back to the same. And so the rise again for student unions in high schools, I think, is really something that I would love to see. But it requires knowledge. And democracy isn't just a practice, something that we have to do. It's also an idea, it's a theory, and it requires knowledge. And unfortunately, for most of our high school students, that knowledge that we are stronger together than we are apart, that knowledge that we can make a change, is something that's all too foreign to them. I remember just prior to the last national election in 2014, I was sitting at a bar with a couple of friends, and some first year university students, a little bit drunk, tried to get us to dance with them. We weren't that interested, we were watching the rugby. And then we talked. They sat down with us, and I guess because it had been in the news at the time, they wanted to talk about the upcoming election. These were three students aged probably about 19. They'd been through the entire school system, they were now at university, studying professions that, educated professions. They were studying to be a nurse, a teacher, and a social worker. And we asked them who they were going to vote for. And their response was, I'm going to vote for the National Party. Okay, that's interesting. Not something I would personally agree with, but that's interesting. Why? Oh, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? What attracts you to them? Why would you want to vote for them? Just John Key. He seems like such a nice bloke. Oh, have you met him? No. Okay, what makes you think? Oh, look, I don't know anything about anything, but I know that I love John Key. And that was what more than one of these people said to me. They were admittedly quite drunk, but I think it was really instructive to know that these people who had been through the entire school system were now at university, didn't actually understand why they wanted to take the action that they wanted to take. They knew to participate in democracy, they knew that it was important, but they didn't know why. Now, if they'd made an educated decision to vote for John Key, if they'd decided that they thought that voting for John Key was in their best interests, I'm not going to agree, but I understand it. But what saddened me was that their position wasn't taken out of a decision-making process where they went through what are the policies we believe in, what are the parties that agree with those policies, that we'll vote for that party. Their decision was simply, I don't know, so I'll just vote for the default. And that to me is a really sad indictment on our education system. But it's also a sad indictment on the way we structure our society. Because like I said at the start, democracy is a practice and we have to keep doing it in order to get used to it. So if we can have a society where democracy isn't unusual, it's not reserved for some special schools out there, but it is in the base of every part of our education system, then people will grow up learning about it. And then if we can extend that to the workplace, where unions together are making a real difference, people joining together in their unions, making a real difference to their workplaces. If we can teach people that democracy works, that collective action works, and that together we can make a difference right from the start, then that gives me hope for the future. But if all we're doing is leaving them separate, if all we're doing is letting people live their lives respecting authority and never questioning, never thinking they can make a change, then why would we ever expect them to vote? And even if they vote, why would we expect them to actually participate in their democracy?
Thank you, Ashley. Our next panellist is Ibrahim Omer. Ibrahim is an activist. He's in particular a living wage activist, and he's at Victoria University of Wellington. He comes from Eritrea, and he's got stories to tell. I'm interested in hearing from Ibrahim, what are some of the obstacles to a functioning democracy that he's experienced? And how do we go about overcoming those obstacles to delivering a just and equitable society? Ibrahim.
Thank you, John. Hello everyone, my name is Ibrahim. I am a refugee background Kiwi now. Been living in New Zealand for 7.5 years now. So democracy is I should say, it's a big word, it's very broad. I'm a political science student, but I still can't find a specific definition for what democracy is. But then I came from a country where democratic exercise is probably below zero. It's one of the most oppressive, known as the North Korea of Africa, where there is no voice for anyone rather than the government, elite, and just quite a few people. I left my country when I was probably a teenage, 16 years old, taking risks that could, knowing that the action that I was taking could have taken my life. But and then I thought that I should, die trying rather than living as in fear and with the closed mouth. So fortunately I did it safe to Sudan, and then a couple of years in Sudan as a refugee, and then moved to New Zealand. So life in New Zealand for me was quite different. I came from a place where I always had to watch over my shoulder. So in New Zealand that was not the case anymore. A couple of months, I think I just keep telling people that who were looking after me, I need a job, I need a job, I need a job. I hate being in unemployment benefit. So my first job I picked up was one of the hostels as a cleaner, working 40 hours, minimum wage probably 12 something. And by the time you finish by the time you get paid 3-4 days, it's all gone, and then you broke. So and then I had to pick up another 40 hours at Victoria University cleaning, 80 hours a week. So no life, you can't think about anything else, no democracy. As a human, you don't have a life. One day in a week, you can't just crash on the couch for a few hours and then wake up, go back to work. So this is just my example, but it's also the case for many refugee background people like myself. So democracy has to be inclusive. To me, it doesn't matter who you are, black, white, yellow, everyone has to be inclusive. For many people, democracy is about just voting and speaking freely. But democracy should be more than that. Democracy should be also about opportunity, people getting equal opportunity, obviously, social justice. If a person is given a right to vote, but then not much a right to survive, to live like a human being, and then it's hard to call that a democracy. That's my personal view. People could disagree, but that's how I see it. So after 3-4 years of working like slave, 80-85 hours, and then came the living wage movement, and they asked me to speak on public at Victoria University challenging the mayoral candidates to become or to commit to the living wage. So I didn't even know what the living wage was, so I had to ask for clarification, and then after that, well, this is right. This is the right thing to do. This actually could give people the opportunity, because every person you talk to, I am involved in polls and other people's elections sometimes when I have a time and go and help them. So I speak to quite a few people, mainly the refugee background people. They don't vote. They don't even know what's happening because they're too busy, they're too worried with their life, they're too worried to provide meal for their kids. They're too busy or they're too worried to just get by. So thousands of people are not voting. So I thought, well, this living wage thing could be, could change, could be a game changer. So for me it was, because the living wage back then was 1840. At that moment, one of the companies that I was working offered me $18, which was nearly living wage. So I dropped one of the jobs. I always wanted to study. I always wanted to be someone, not just someone who, scrub floors for 80, 90 hours a week. So the first opportunity, I went to Victoria University and enrolled, working full-time, studying full-time for a few months, and then that was hard. So I reduced some of the hours and become full-time student, part-time worker. So it's still hard, but I was getting the living wage. So things were working for me. And now I'm one semester away from graduating. That's because of my involvement in the living wage. I do get paid the living wage, probably more now. But so the reason why I got involved in the living wage, first, I believe in social justice, because I thought that even though I got safety, I was safe in New Zealand, but I also was disadvantaged in terms of the income opportunity, the income equality. So now I dedicate quite a lot of time campaigning the living wage activists, because I believe that people that who are not getting opportunity should get opportunity and should become active citizens in society and should exercise their rights, such as one of the rights is voting and making change. So if those people, we're talking about thousands of people, if those people don't vote, and then how are we going to make a change that we want? How are we going to bring the government that we believe in, that can make a change that we want? So yes, New Zealand is known as one of the most democratic nations in the world, but then when you look into things closely, it's there's a long way to go in terms of, yes, police don't serve you and arrest you, but we're talking about the social justice. To me, democracy is about opportunity, about equality, about social justice. If we miss these things, and then it's harder to follow democracy.
Thank you very much. Our next panellist is Paul Eagle, who is an experienced Wellington City Councillor. He represents the Southern Ward, which has got an interesting cycleway issue going at the moment. He, in his first term as a City Councillor, he chaired the Community Engagement section, and that's particularly appropriate, I think, for this discussion. He's had a background in communications, and his perspective is one of functioning politics, where he's one of the officials in the system, duly elected, and he's going to talk to us about the dynamics around that. Paul.
Thanks. Tēnā koutou, and thank you for the invitation, and privileged to be on the panel with you guys here this evening. when I got the topic from Pat, I thought, oh, democracy. I thought, that's easy to talk about. So what I thought I'd do is give you some insights, some positives, some negatives, some ups and downs, and probably leave you with a few questions more than giving you the answers. And in 6 weeks' time, the obvious thing is we've got local body elections on the table, and one of the biggest issues in terms of democracy is that it's not, the orange person doesn't pop up. You don't see an orange sign on the street side, and you don't go into a booth and tick a paper and put it in a box.
I thought you meant Trump for a moment.
And then that's it. And I guess the first concern there is, or something to ponder, is the electoral system we use, which is STV. And in the sense that in our central government elections we use MMP, and in the local body elections it's STV, and that's not consistent across New Zealand. And that's, when I hear some of the stories of Ibrahim, and you are door knocking and you are having conversations with people about, there is an election coming up, it's no wonder that only 40% of Wellingtonians actually vote. And that's sometimes a bit higher, sometimes a bit lower. And I think what Asher was saying was really good in terms of some of those reasons, some of the key issues in terms of getting people to vote. But that's one of them. So our electoral, the system we use is confusing. I'm not saying it's wrong. What I'm saying is that when you are having a conversation even about the local body elections, and you're at the door and the person is concerned with just trying to live their life and have a decent life, let alone trying to comprehend what you are articulating to them about saying, hey, in 3 weeks' time, there's an envelope coming and you'll be bombarded with voting for a mayor, a city councillor, a regional councillor, and 7 district health board members. That's a lot to take in. Then you've got to say to them, it's not about ticking, it's about preferencing. That's another conversation that they have to take in. So, that's a concern, and I think that's something that when I look back at some of the figures, some of the percentages of people who vote, it's pretty static around 40. Online voting came up this year in terms of, hey, the government said, why don't we pilot it? Wellington City put its hand up to say, yep, let's give it a go. And so the question there was, will that address some of that 40%? Will that bump it higher? Or will the fact that what Asher raised in terms of getting young people voting and getting that civics program sorted at an earlier age, because I'm told if you vote when you're 18, you're on the railway for life in terms of voting forever. And so making sure that there's better understanding at that level, regardless of whether it's online or postal. The next thing I wanted to talk about was just some of the issues facing local government on a positive side. Just up the road here in Brooklyn, down through to Kingston, that community led a process which was probably the best example of a community-led participatory democracy process. So very much a case of that community working with the city and being involved in facilitating on their terms what matters most to them. And that was quite dynamic for Wellington City. The sort of status of things had got to a stage, and I will talk about the cycleway a bit later under projects. But what we saw there was a community saying, how do we take control of our destiny, and how do we spend, or how do we determine, or be part of the decision-making process to spend the resources that are going to be spent in this area, or how do we determine what resources we want and how that money should be spent. And so that's a process you've probably never heard about. And interestingly enough, when I looked at what they'd achieved and been part of the fringe, I mean, one of the things they said is, as a decision maker, we want you involved in the process, but it's community led. And then I want to sort of put that right up against something called council controlled organisations, and I want to just put a stark contrast in there of right now there are talks around saying, hey, we should set up more of these council controlled companies. So you'll have an unelected board, you'll have a new CEO that gets paid 500k, you'll have a new culture, you'll have a new style of working, which in my view is undemocratic. But how do you contrast that with communities who are saying we want more power to determine the way we want things in our community, yet the Local Government Act and this minister are saying you should set up more council controlled companies to run public services. So I just want to leave that there. Just on the project side to finish off, we did have and we are still continuing the process of the cycleway in Island Bay, and for me, I mean, that's a really, cycling is great, it's a progressive idea, but how do you work in a space where you've got something progressive, you know it's the right thing to do, but then the council is perceived as imposing ideas on communities. And one mayoral candidate, I think last night, suggested that there should be some fund that gives funding back to communities to empower them to do the things that they want to do. Within that we saw lobbying, advocacy, and a real debate, probably what for me became a debate about process and people versus the actual subject, which was cycling. But it could have been anything. If you took cycling out, you would be left, if you were to unpick it, was the process, was this people focused? And that's probably the question that has always remained on my mind. So I'm going to leave that there, but that's just some ideas to get people's minds thinking about local government of today.
Thank you. Now, while the panel's just thinking about the next phase, I'm just going to mention a few key words that they mentioned that rang a chord with me at the time. And Dolores, she talked about the role of money in electing our representatives, and it seems to be huge. She talked about selecting our government, about active participation of the people, about protection of human rights and protection of the citizens, and the rule of law. Asher talked about democracy as being a practice, but not only that, an idea that requires knowledge and education. We can make a change once we understand that unity is empowerment. And he talked about our place in the world. As children, we know our place. As employees, our boss is in control of what we do day to day, and we really can explore change away from that situation and join together to make a real difference. Ibrahim, a refugee from the most oppressive country, he had to watch his back. You can't think about democracy if you're battling to survive. Democracy, in that sense, is a luxury to some people. And it's not just voting and speaking freely. Social justice is important, but if you're too busy or ignorant or fearful or in survival mode, then he provides a ray of hope by saying that For example, the living wage has provided options for people in those situations. And he said we must vote to make the changes we want. Opportunity and equality and social justice. And Paul, who's a working city councillor, a hard-working city councillor who is making things happen in a democratic environment. And there are great difficulties and interests to balance. The Wellington city area is an STV voting system with preferences. Only 40% of Wellingtonians vote. Improving that percentage is vitally important. He acknowledged people in survival mode and he gave a great example of a community local participation process and the community working with the city. He talked about process with a people focus and the need to balance interests in such projects as a cycleway, which is progressive and good for people, but can feel like an opposition to others. I would really like the Wellingtons to thank our participants once again. I think they've all done a fine job in analysing these issues and bringing their ideas to us to work with. Now, would any of you like to add to what you said in view of what we've all just heard?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind referring on just something that Paul talked about, the good example, the Kaka project in Brooklyn and Kingston. So that's where I live, that's my community, and I've been not incredibly involved, but somewhat involved in part of that community consultation and creation process. And it's been a really perfect example to me of what local government could be. And I think too often, local government is seen as rubbish and rates, rather than about creating community. And I think this example of a community construction of saying we're not even one community as a wider Brooklyn, it's several sub-communities with some resources already, some great spaces that could be further developed, some organisations that already exist. But how can we work together to decide what is the best for our whole community? And then how can we approach council together and say, this is what we want, how can you support us to have this? It's been a really great example, and the little bit that I have been involved has been a really rewarding process. But I also think it reflects on some of what Ibrahim said, and it probably can tie into some of the Island Bay cycleway drama as well, in that that kind of project requires a sense of ownership over your community. And for a lot of people, and particularly younger people, we're moving around so much that we don't actually feel like we have a sense of ownership over our geographic community. So I'm 31, I've lived in over 50 houses in my life. And to me, I have parts of Wellington where I've spent most of my life that I really consider my home, the South Coast. I've lived in 6 different suburbs in the South Coast, but the South Coast is my home. It's where I grew up. Whether I lived in Island Bay or Lisle Bay or Newtown or Kilburnie or, or Rewhero Bay or Brooklyn now. That wider area is still my home. But that cuts across 3 different council regions, 3 different council wards. That cuts across 2 different electorates. It cuts across a whole bunch of different things. And Brooklyn, where I live now, is not my real community. I've been there less than 2 years. And probably in 6 months, I'll be somewhere completely different. So without a real sense of ownership over your community, it's hard to feel like you really want to put the time in to properly engage in creating it. And so it ties in to the lack of home ownership across New Zealand. The dropping levels of home ownership and our incredibly anti-renting laws mean that people who don't own a house find it very hard to have a sense of ownership over their community, over where they live, and thereby are much less likely to participate in wanting to make that a better place. And so I think that's something that we really need to be thinking about in terms of local government particularly.
Oh, thank you, Ashley. Yes, issues with participation. Thank you. Somebody else?
Well, I just wanted to speak to the education issue because I don't think it's just a problem of local government, it's also the national government. And I was on the Victoria University Council before the law was changed to get rid of most of the democratic elements of university governance. And we were going to the Tertiary Education Commission, and all it talked about was what the business community needed from universities, which was engineers. And when I kept saying, but what about democratic citizenship, and isn't education supposed to be about that, it was just sort of like that wasn't on their agenda. And I discovered that the Tertiary Education Commission, every meeting it has, is with the Ministry of Innovation and Business, rather than with any other entity. So the tertiary education is being steered to be about what's good for business and not necessarily about what's good for New Zealand society. And I think that is an ongoing problem. And I also think that journalism is another area where if we want an educated citizenry, that is an area that's actually declining in quite dramatic ways. And I've just been thinking of the last couple of weeks, we have a business section of the newspaper, but no civic or a citizen section of the, and I've been reading the business people in these business sections saying, we need more engineers, we need more engineers. And then at the very end, they'll say, okay, yes, maybe there's music and writing and other things are useful, but it's always the last couple of sentences and the rest of it is what's good, and saying, why aren't there places where we talk about what's good for New Zealand and citizens and so forth? And I think that education and journalism are both areas that are in some sense very important to citizenship and democracy, but are right now being in some sense
constructive
used.
suggestion. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just want to emphasize the role of, or the importance of local body election. A lot of people think that it's not that important, and they tend to focus to the national election. To me, I think the local body election is as important as the national election in terms of citizens exercising their rights and electing their own representatives. The local election is, to me, really is as I've been working with Paul and the other councillors very closely around the living wage for the last 3 years, and Paul, Justin, and Celia and others were really they have been solid in terms of their commitment to make the Wellington City Council the first council in New Zealand, the living wage council in New Zealand. And that commitment still continues against all odds from the business sector, from indirectly the national government itself. But their response to the community is valid, to the community's request is been really, I just want to
Here.
That was a good example of community asking and the politicians responding, and that's also a good example of democracy. So I just want to say, keep up what you're doing. And on Thursday we are running the forum, the candidates forum at Wesley Church. So I hope to see you all there.
Thank you.
Well, it's really interesting hearing this because I mean, Ash is quite right. You know, I guess what he's saying is, well, what is community? Who are a community? And one size doesn't fit all. Well, you can reflect on a mechanism that works for one part of Wellington, it won't work for another. And you know, often we're up against easy things for council to deal with. Like if it's easy for council to send one email to a residents association, they are being democratic, they are consulting, they are engaging, but it's far from it. And that's just quite right around saying that, you know, people are transient, and actually what I'm learning what I learnt through the online suggestion was that's becoming a more and more valid tool, and getting bureaucrats and politicians' heads around this to say how do you cope with this? How do you vote with it? How does it become a valid tool in terms of engagement? How does it, how there are mechanisms now, like Lumio, for example, where it's an online democracy tool, but getting that treated as being valid is a concern. The other point, just quickly, is around this whole business or sort of economic drive. Where we're constantly, what I'm seeing, the narrative coming back in is like we've got it. Once we get economic development right, social development comes secondary to that, and that's the old sort of trickle down. We have to be subservient to business all the time. We're constantly being pushed and shoved around by by the chamber, for example, and that's unhealthy. That's not a desired relationship where I don't think you can. That's an old paradigm. It's an old ideological way of undertaking council business. Now, it should be people, not this trickle down theory. And I'm just seeing that. I'm seeing that narrative come back in. We get the business right, and then the social and community is all sorted and fixed.
Thank you, Paul. Now, anything else that the panel would like to say about anything that we've discussed?
Well, since we believe in active engagement, I think it should be people from their lives.
Yes, they get their turn now.
They get their turn.
Yeah. A question for the panel.
Yeah, I've got a question. Just listening, it's been very interesting. So, what's the role of the media in all of this? When we talk about democracy.
Yeah.
The media.
Yeah.
We talk about democracy. I think it's just a word. I don't think we've actually had active democracy in this country since the late 80s and 90s, definitely from 1991, when we got rid of the collectivity that we had, not only in workplaces but in society. And we said to our kids, and we said to those young people and those who are having children, don't worry, just work hard, get ahead for yourself. It's the rise of the individual. I personally don't think that. I think we'd be paying lip service to any form of democracy that we perceive that we have. And I think the media has had a huge role in that. And it's more so when you do have basically like a right-leaning government, if you like, which has got the business behind it. And that seems to frame the narrative. So as much as we try to have our own narrative around social justice, around collectivity and all the rest of it, I think we're sort of pushing shit uphill, so to speak. I'm sorry you can bleep that out. And until we sort of look at the messages that are coming out and how can we work around that narrative that's coming from big business, that's coming from the right. That's, just thoughts on that.
How do we work around that narrative?
I think, for me, I preface this by saying I've been a freelance journalist. I write for a living, so I have lots of friends who work in the media as well. I think part of the problem is the lack of a compelling counter-narrative. So we have a very compelling, logical narrative from business that gets trotted out in the media, but also in a whole bunch of other parts of the public sphere, including education, as Dolores was talking about, that the left in New Zealand hasn't been able to counter. There's been a whole bunch of attempts at it, and some slightly better, some slightly worse, but there isn't one overarching compelling counter-narrative from the left. And I think if there was, we'd be seeing a different stance in the media. Not that, because the media isn't really, it's not that relevant what individual journalists think. Actually, on the whole, individual journalists are more left-wing than the average population. But that's not that important. What's important is how do you tell a story? That's what a journalist needs to do in their job, day to day. If you make it easy for them to tell a story, they will tell that story. If you make it an interesting story to read, people will read that story. And as a wider left movement, we've really struggled to come up with a compelling counter-narrative, not over our specific issues, but an overarching one that covers how we want to see society. And I think particularly with the demise of journalism, with the demise of the mainstream media, with less and less journalists having to pump out more and more stories, going on a 24/7 to pump out stories to the net rather than a daily paper round or whatever, that it becomes much harder for journalists to dig in depth. They have less resources, they have less time, and often less experience, because the experienced journalists are off doing something else, mostly working in communications for government ministers. It's the vast majority of journalists who work for the Dominion Post, who work for the Herald, are under 30. They're young, they're unexperienced, and this is the only journalism they've known. And that's a real tragedy, I think, for us.
I guess really in some ways, Asher, it's more the case, more the question than that the media is actually the big business. And like, that's precarious work, you know, and I get that for those young journalists, and that it is precarious work, so people now do not actually go against the flow, because they've got, you know, there's too much to lose, you know, because of the nature of how as a society we've said, that's fine, you know.
Precarious work is itself an anti-democratic factor.
And then interesting enough, they're all union members. Because, you know, when it comes to their constant restructuring, they'll pop out their union membership. Yeah, so it's quite interesting. I always find that interesting dynamic in itself.
I think also, like, as we've had more centralised media as well, you know, the Dominion Post is no longer an entity in itself. It's now the largest part of Fairfax. So we used to have local papers in all the different parts of the country that report on local issues. More and more now we have two big companies, possibly soon to be one, that centralise essentially all their reporting. So it means you have less space for Wellington reporters to report about Wellington Council. You have less space for Christchurch reporters to report about Christchurch. You have less space for Wairarapa reporters to report about the Wairarapa and smaller communities. Instead, you just have reporters who happen to be working in Christchurch or Wellington or Masterton who are reporting on national issues, and that's a real loss to local democracy.
I think the reason why that's sort of why I raised it as a question for me, you know, and it was because every single one of you actually touched on parts of it that I was sort of thinking, well, is the message that's coming at us all the time is really, it's just completely business driven. It's money, you know, it's like it's the sound bites and it's the headlines, you know, when you talk to Asher about those three young ones, you know, and because I had the same thing, you know, every election cycle it's been the same, and it's, you know, in 2008 was, well, it's a time for change. Change to what? Why change, you know, because, you know, and then it was in 2011 was, oh, well, you know, he's such a nice looking, you know, and same as in 2014, oh, well, we know what's happening, you know, we're relatively safe. So it's the sound bites, and it's not the community that's driving those sound bites and those bylines that are printed in newspapers and that frame the advertising that we see on television. It is definitely the.
And in 2016, he's still polling high. I mean, after 8-9 years of you know, the national government, you would think that people would change. But then the media, the campaign of the media is bad and in the favor of the national government. It's not separate at all. Look at the way Nicaragua was treated, the way even the police have treated him. So the role of the media, unfortunately, is very clear. But how do we fight back?
There's been a good example with the living wage here, because here you've had, you know, you've been fortunate to have strong individuals who have pulled together a movement, and that movement has, you know, it's got all the 101s down pat of running a good, strong campaign. But that's a lot of work. I mean, and every time they had the other side put up, they were there with their message, and they were rolling out good people all the time saying, you know, here's living proof of the situation that we're trying to sort out.
And the result is we've got some media and we persuaded the council. Some of the councillors were reluctant. I think there's a message in that if we do get together about vital stuff like having enough dough to be able to get somewhere decent to live, then we can persuade the decision-making apparatus. We've got to, and I would hope that the council, maybe another project is to say, what else can the council do to encourage people to get together and make demands on structures, and then escalate that.
Well, I think the housing, okay.
There's no mistake in what you say, Paul, about the way they're engineering all these groups to be a manager and you know, assistant managers to look after that area rather than collective community boards or something like that. And that sort of designed type operation, you know, it's not only in the councils but it's also in the regional councils and the water boards and all the rest of it. And one of the things that you'd have to take on board is that all the people who got thrown out of them positions by the National Party when they first came in, and I'm talking Glasgow, you name it, they cleared everybody out, and to wrest the power back to the people, somehow or other, all of them groupings, the housing issues and all that, you know, what's wrong with it? You know, I mean, Gordon Gekko's had his day. Greed was good, but now it's bad. And social order is good, you know, I mean, good housing, good transport, good education, like Dolores says, you know, without having to be based from big business slant on it. You know, what's wrong with the arts and literature and all the other things that make people think, you know what I mean, really think, rather than being automatons, you know, in a system.
How can we
Business wants a way up, you know.
How can we provoke a response to this?
You know,
We could go after Peter Dunn, that would be a good thing.
Oh,
He's been one crucial vote. He wouldn't even talk to us from the universities when we were talking about this change of the university governance structure, which is an undemocratic kind of restriction. And he refused to even talk to us. So I think, you know, that's one area where politicians who don't support democracy need to be called to account. And I think housing, obviously, as Asher was talking about, is another crucial area which city councils and others need to be very much committed to making sure that nobody is having to sleep on the street in Wellington, and making sure that people actually have a place to live. But I think we have to be aware that it looks like 47% of New Zealanders like it the way it is because they're property owners. And that is one of the sort of cleavages in New Zealand society, is those who own versus those who don't. And that, I think, is widening. And that's been an American characteristic, because it was a property owners' republic that was formed. Nobody could vote except for 6% of the population at the time that the first U.S. government was established. Gradually, that was diminished to some extent, but it's been, in some sense, reinvigorated by these court decisions. So that is an area where, how do you make people aware that just because their house is maximizing in value, that the other side of it is other people living on the street? How do you make people, in some sense, go beyond self-interest to look at the wider society? And housing, I think, is one of those issues that brings some of that to people's attention. But the national government usually says, we're doing things so that people can have their conscience kind of soothed. We're doing this and that, and so just enough so that people who are worried will be, oh, we're doing things. Okay.
So this is a good example. Sue talked about the media, so we had John Key yesterday on nationwide television giving numbers around this, and he's suddenly changing the narrative of saying there's 41,000. Oh, but that was the same when Helen Clark was around. So what you've done is now got people. So we're not talking about people anymore. We're now talking about numbers, and the numbers gaining. People start going, oh yeah, well it was bad under them, but it's bad now. And so it's using the media to start. You know, and I always call it like this, sort of massaging it now, trying to, and you've got Phil Twyford there, trying to hit back and bring it back to the point at hand. It doesn't matter around the sort of the nuts and bolts. There's 41,000 people, and then he got into definitions of, but if you segment that 41,000, it's actually this. But the fact the media is giving the airtime for him to get that across is very difficult if the same airtime was not applied. But that's a very good example about how you've got...
the same lie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they
That's-
doubled their PR budget under the current government. I think they had 36 or 40 or something, and that's where a lot of the funding they get from large corporations, they don't have to spend on elections, they spend on public relations, and I think that is an ongoing issue. How do you deal with that amount of resources on one side and people who don't have as much? That's one of the reasons about this compelling narrative. Some voices get a lot more time to repeat everything over and over and over again, which was very much what the Reagan administration was about, was repeating
Sorry.
the same thing.
That's where we need to get better at telling our story, because I think the reality is that, you know, those voices with money will always have more airtime to tell their side of the story than ours. But that doesn't mean we can't tell our story more effectively. And I think that's something that the Living Wage campaign is one of the best examples we've had in New Zealand recently of doing, of making it not about numbers, making it not about 1825 or 1840 or 1925 or whatever you want the living wage to be, but making it about people saying, you know, I don't want just to make a living, I want to have a life. And people telling their own stories is the most powerful tool that we have as a movement for social justice, for positive social change. And I think that's something that Renters United has started to do a little bit around housing. I think there is still a new campaign, but they're doing some really interesting work around telling those stories about what it means to have insecure housing, telling stories about what it means to live in a house with black mould growing in every wall, you know, what that means for your life, and just like the Living Wage has done. And I think that's something that we can really learn from as a broader movement, about not getting stuck and quibbling with John Key about 41,000 or 40,000, how much it was in 2008 and how much it is in 2016, but actually saying, well,
People's
this
lives.
is one person telling their story, and that's one person too many. And if you can look at this one person in the face and tell them they don't deserve a house, then you're a much worse human being than I thought.
Yeah, thank you, Asher.
Very well.
Now, another question from the audience.
Could I be allowed to say something rather than ask a question?
Well, we'd like something to be able to be discussed, so a brief point.
It's
Yes.
a discussion.
Well, Boris said, how do we change things? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like what Ashley was saying. People telling their own stories. I'll just throw in my tuppence worth as well.
So just speak up a little, thanks.
Yeah, I throw in my tuppence worth as well as
Yes.
we need grassroots democracy.
Yes.
From grassroots movements like the Living Wage,
Yes.
and unite the movement, the campaigns they ran for the $15, get $15 an hour, which was some years ago, and of course now because of inflation it's well out of date, but the way they used and supersized my pay, those campaigns were groundbreaking campaigns, and I'm sure that the...
Thank you. Well, look, comments from the panel about that?
I agree with John. Going back to grassroots and building community power is the way to, I think, face the challenges. What the Living Way trying to do is basically going back to the real people on the ground and getting them involved and tell their stories. You know, real people who are going through difficult times. I just came back from 1 week training where we've been 25 people closed together like for 1 week discussing about building the power, community power. My experience is the Sixth Council was doing the long-term plan last year, and the Living Wage was not even part of the long-term plan. And then there was, in every ward there was the campaign. People just, in every forum would turn up like they would fill in, the whole room, and probably 70-80% of those people living wage activists, people who care about the living wage. I'm here for living wage. We're all with their badges with them. So and then the change, the city council, turned around and made the living wage part of the long-term plan, which is 10 years. Not only that, we ended up winning the living wage for contracts, which was 3 years ago, and even think impossible to think even about. So the point is we have to go back to the real values that New Zealand was known for, was known as the egalitarian state, and that was reached in 80s, the neoliberal. So going back to the real people is the way to make a difference.
So is there another campaign, another project akin to the living wage campaign that people could rally around that might make a difference?
Yeah, because I mean the idea about grassroots, I love it, and usually at the local government level, this is something that galvanises the left, so it unites the left and focuses it. We're able to dictate the narrative on it. You know, the arrogant to get out what we want to get. But it's difficult. I mean, some of the things that I've been involved with have been that they are grassroots community, but it's like saving a community hall from being sold. So stopping the council selling community assets off like playgrounds and community halls. And I mean, that's a massive, huge thing for communities. But then they but in terms of how they link to a political narrative or say a left narrative, that's in my mind when I'm saving like a playground, I just come as Paul, the local councillor, but it's how do I go the next step? How do I get them, because they're there from what I assume all political types, but they're united around the grassroots issue, which is leaving our playground alone. It's advancing that next step to say actually, you know, you are suddenly all activists, you're all passionate around something. It's how to extend that. I don't have an answer to that, but it is constantly on my mind.
Victoria?
Well, it's actually something you said, Paul, about the disconnect between the process and the people in one particular example, but I'm sure everybody's got other examples of the disconnect. And it seems that the living wage was not a disconnect between the process and the people. It was direct. It was the what you said. It was the relationships, and it was the not giving up. But what do you do when you get into the grey areas? Is it that what do you do when save the playground means finite resource, save the playground means no money for X? And it seems to me that this is tying into what Sue brought up, is that we are not calling out the right people. We're not calling out what Dolores referred to. We're not calling out the interest of money. We're not calling out why things are not happening.
Yeah. So this is really good because I would spend more time doing that, and yet an airport extension or movie museum convention centre can go through like that. And that is a very good example of that. So the money man gets in because they're part of a lobby, they're privileged access into the money man, i.e. the CEO. All the promises are made, yet if I'm trying to save a playground, I'm negative and it's only a playground, just get rid of it. I mean, so that's, I don't know, I don't know if I'm demonstrating it well enough, but I am constantly amazed at how valuable assets or things that matter most to people on the ground at the grassroots, and the disrespect that's afforded to those people is huge versus the gold elite access into council for those on the money side who've got the big projects. And that is a stark as day. Like I see them getting, they get meetings more easily. They get their committee reports are public excluded, so it's fast tracked. So in terms of the democratic bent on that, it's appalling.
Well, the democratic bent is their own type of democracy, which is actually not the type of democracy that we, I think.
Because what I feel is people want basic services done well from your council, and there's a whole lot of stuff that sits above the line, which is like, well, yeah, I mean, you could help there's a whole lot of people-focused initiatives and things that are just put into that grey area of like,
But if you think back to, Paul, sorry, but you think back to, just briefly to the living wage when it first came out, Deborah Littman and what at the very beginning, and it wasn't a smooth process to start with at all. It was some real bumpy times, and you remember Ashton and that as well, but it wasn't until the different parts of the community came together and they got rid of some of the layers and they actually took it as a values proposition. They took it back to a values base, and that was where they found common ground. So you've got churches and trade unions not at historically great hours. Dentists and doctors, all that. You've got people who believe in the living wage because it's a values based and it's about, it hits here. It's like when I used to work for the IHC years ago, it used to get you here and that's why you keep doing it. It's that. But it took a lot of work, and it was like an onion being unpeeled to actually get that core thing. So that particular campaign is almost like a blueprint of how do you get a campaign that has the breadth that we need to actually get community democracy up by taking some of those learnings in some ways.
I think one of the values-based thing is somewhere decent to live. I like, one of the good things about the living wage thing is people have said it was positive, seemed to be positive. I'm not quite sure how we put it together, but if we could get a similar coalition together, not just a living wage, but a living place, I felt more secure living in London for 10 years when I was renting, because the laws were better than I do from owning a flat in a townhouse complex. Where, I don't know what's happening, but I'm beginning to feel...
Yeah, I mean, Asha, I don't know, maybe because of the position you're in, home ownership does not make you feel any more secure. My home ownership in an earthquake, in a building that the Wellington City Council decided was earthquake, wiped out my savings. I will never be able to save $100,000. And yet that is what a decision of a risk-averse council and over-cautious engineers did. And so, I think the simplistic solutions, sometimes values sure, but simplistic solutions is not necessarily the answer. Education is. Education about, yes, it's complex. If we want this, then maybe we can't have that. But it's got to be tied to the calling out why we can't have things. Why can't we have another nurse? Because we're spending X amount on
charter schools.
A charter school. Well, that's what I meant. The calling out of where things come from. I don't think we like that. We don't like to say that. We like to wrap ourselves in New Zealand. It's so nice. It's such a nice place.
I mean, is that our new campaign? Is that our new platform? The fact that precarious is a thing that now seems to be coming through across a whole range: home ownership or not home ownership, employment or not employment, healthcare or not healthcare, education or not education. Is that the one word that ties all of these things together? That it's actually we are now in a state of living in precarious times. Is that the one thing that is going to cut right across?
Someone in your family gets sick.
Sue, I think you've caught something there. Excuse me, Victoria.
What was wrong with Cradle to the Grave? They blackguarded the health system and the old age pension. Because that's the latest one they're lining up. But what is wrong with the narrative that working people should work and enjoy a retirement and have health, and even the young people having education and you're having social housing and looking after your playgrounds,
Absolutely.
I can't believe that Nicola Young is advocating a huge revamp for the big end of town, while the small end of town is losing, hasn't got footpaths still in the city, lots of other things that are going on. But this is how the narrative is skewed so much one way. and our story and the people's story is something that really has got to be told over and over again.
Well, let people, just to reflect on that, I mean, we sold we disestablished our in-house works unit. So 37, so the unit was 1,700 big 15 years ago. 37 guys hold the fort, but 500 years of service between them. So all of our people, and what I saw there was, they had institutional knowledge. They had built most of the, all of them had worked in the works department when it had different branches of the sorts. But they disappeared just one Friday. It was actually the Friday of the storm that bowled out the Isle of Bay Seawall. And instead of having their farewell on that Thursday night, they've got in their trucks. They meant to have a big feed and a big farewell, but they worked all through the night, cleaned up the city, so it was all perfect, parked up their trucks down at the Happy Valley, and then that was it. And I just thought that's not, this is just so wrong. And so 3 years they went to several contractors. Some lost their jobs. So I think the average working life at the council was at 37. Oh no, it was actually 28 years. Yeah. So there were 37 staff, 28 years average in terms of employment we left. But they went on to the 90-day rule suddenly because that's law. Their depot wasn't in Happy Valley, it was out at Seaview because that's where the infrastructure companies are. They had a whole new culture. They went from getting well above the living wage to being on $16.50. So, and their demands were small. Like, I used to hear stories there at the depot where they said, oh, now I'm the truck driver, I get paid $21 instead of $20. But the dollar extra over the day, over the week equaled this. So their demands were small. But the stories were massive in terms of how they go past this and pick up that and trim that and do that. And they loved the city. It wasn't a contract, it wasn't a specification. And to fast forward, the Australian-based contractor who picked it up and then outsourced different parts of their contract has now walked away. So Ventia, who were Laytons, are completely gone. They don't have any presence here. So, and that's undocumented. No one talks about it. No one talks about the people. I don't know what happened to the Ventia employees who were probably treated really badly. But that's a story that I don't even want to see again. I don't ever want to go farewell, see these guys go, and I hate that. I don't even know what. I mean, I see one driving for Woods Waste, no tire, or he's always, g'day mate. I don't see the other guys in their different uniforms. I don't even know who's, I think Downers picked it up. But that's no one's documented that experience. But under the Local Government Act, it's told we've got to give it to the most cost-effective contractor. And they, beat, they're doing a shit job. They've done a shit job. The people of the South are infuriated by the just the lack of a core council service delivering value to that community. But in terms of the values that we have in this room, that goes undocumented. And that's probably going on all over New Zealand as councils outsource. People are wearing, there's a movie about a British train company, and some guy comes along and changes the name of the railway company every 5 minutes. It's now called East West Rail Limited and South Coast Rail Limited. And it's a bit like, council. I mean, they've got Ventia on the door now, it's Intergroup, now it's Downer. It's the same truck, it's just got a different sticker on it. But the wages, the way that people are treated is worse than ever.
And that's the plague of contract here, is that, and we see it, not just in core works, but for example, Wellington Public Transport, controlled by Wellington Regional Council, Greater Wellington Regional Council, and they're quite explicit that what they want is more bus companies operating the routes. They don't want the couple of contractors that we've got now. We've got Mana and we've got GoBus controlling most of it. They want 3, 4, 5 different contractors bidding for bus routes. And that's a fixed service. It costs a certain amount to buy petrol for a bus. It costs a certain amount to buy a bus. The only place that those contractors can really make savings is in wages. So what we're saying to them is we want you to compete on who can pay your drivers the least, and whoever says that they'll pay their drivers the least, you're the ones we're going to pick. That's a disgraceful way for us to be operating a core public service.
It certainly is. And I'm going to, I think, call it closed here because we're getting onto a theme here where everybody's getting quite passionate about how dreadful things are, and we really
Okay.
it would be good to focus more on how we address that and how we progress away from that. And we've been doing that.
Positive way.
We talked about the narrative. We need to challenge the bad narrative. We need to provide great examples of narratives that will catch people's hearts and minds. And I love the idea that Sue had, that maybe the common element that we could latch onto for a passionate campaign to change the government might be based on this precarious situation that people are in, with housing, with jobs, with their culture, with their futures, with their children's educations, all of those things. Maybe they're precarious, maybe that can be the thing that catches people's
No, that's still a
imaginations.
negative. I think, we need a positive as well as a negative. So positive, not precarious, or public good, and something that is affirmative, which is what living wage had. And it was the labor movement who reformulated the living wage and captured the framing of that issue in a different way. Though I could say that a Catholic priest named John Ryan invented the concept back in 1906. So it has taken a while. And it was a priest and who also worked with the labor movement. So the fact that it's church and labor isn't necessarily an odd thing. It's also it's historical as well. But that maybe public good coalition would be one umbrella kind of term that you could say, what is in the public good? And all of these different issues would, fall under that. So it's a positive thing, and ending precariousness would be the negative side.
True, and thank you. And I think the example of going back to that example of the living wage is a great way to finish our discussion tonight. So thank you everybody for participating in this Federation of Workers' Educational Associations Discovering Democracy event, and I'm so grateful to our panellists.